we have a few topics left here, like I said, in ecology to sort of wrap up this section. And so, in an ecosystem, we already have said, the living organisms interact with each other, they affect each other, they affect the non-living parts of their environment as well. And one additional way that species interact with each other is through this very close relationship. When one species sort of lives on or in another, depends on the other, and we call this symbiosis. So symbiosis is this close relationship between two species, and there's kind of three categories that we will talk about: parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. And we talked about parasitism already as our question of the day. So in parasitism, two organisms have this relationship, and one of those organisms is injured or harmed by the other. The organism that is injured or harmed is called the host, and the organism that is benefiting from this is called the parasite. Parasite-host relationship. Can you guys give me an example of a parasite that you've heard of or that you're familiar with? Nigella? Tapeworm. So tapeworm is a flatworm, phylum Platyhelminthes, that gets into the digestive tract of an organism, an animal, sometimes even a person, and it attaches inside of the intestine, and then as the person eats, the tapeworm gets its nutrients from that digested food moving through the digestive system. And it grows larger, can reproduce inside of a person. And they can grow so numerous and so large that they actually kind of clog up the intestines. They're absorbing many of the nutrients the person needs. And so that's obviously a parasitic relationship. The tapeworm is benefiting. Has a place to live, it's protected, it's as much food as it needs. However, the animal that it's affecting is being harmed. It's stealing nutrients from the animal. I think I told you guys back when my puppy had to get dewormed. They gave her the deworming medication, and then just dozens of worms came out when she went to the bathroom that had that. Most puppies are infected soon after birth with parasitic worms. That's why if you've ever heard of deworming, it's what they usually do to a puppy before you get it. At like 6 weeks or whatever, you would adopt a puppy. They give it this medication to kill all those worms. It's fairly common. But there's lots of other parasites. We talked about leeches as a parasite, lamprey as a vertebrate parasite, fleas and ticks. All those things are examples of parasites. There's even parasitic plants. So many of these, when we're in Costa Rica, that they actually don't have their own root system. They grow and attach to other plants, sort of stealing away nutrients and things from the plant. Another type of symbiotic, did you question, Alex?
Yeah, is a mosquito a parasite?
Not so much. I mean, it's sort of, there's not a strict definition, but usually when we think parasites, they permanently or for a long time live in or on the other organism. So a mosquito doesn't, it just sort of feeds and then leaves. So I would say no. A mutualism is a symbiotic relationship when the two species interacting both benefit. They both get something positive out of the environment, out of the relationship. Oh gosh. So a bee and a flower have this mutualistic relationship. They both are benefiting. How does the bee benefit from its relationship with the flower? Mia? Gets nectar. Yeah, it gets food from the flower. And how does the flower benefit? The what? Yeah, it pollinates. the bee is spreading its pollen, helping it to reproduce. So they're both benefiting. This is an animal, this is called the Nile crocodile. It's like a ferocious predator. Sometimes they even kill people. And it's a carnivore, obviously. But this Nile crocodile actually will open up its mouth and allow this little bird called the Egyptian plover to walk into its mouth, peck around in there, and walk right back out. And the Nile crocodile never harms it. And it's because they have a mutualistic relationship. They've evolved to have this relationship. Can you get, what is the crocodile, how is it benefiting from letting this bird walk into its mouth? Savannah?
Doesn't it like point its teeth?
It does. The Egyptian plover is pecking around its teeth, cleaning any decaying tissue. It's sort of like dental floss. And so its teeth remain healthy. They don't get diseased or infected in any way. So the crocodile is benefiting. How about the Egyptian plover, the bird? That?
It doesn't die.
It doesn't get eaten. How's it benefiting though?
In the food?
Yeah, it's getting little bits of food. The stuff it picks out from the teeth of the crocodile, that's what it eats. So they're both benefiting. So this is mutualism. They're both benefiting from this close relationship. Here's another example that you probably have seen. The clownfish and the sea anemone. And typically sea anemones, they have tentacles. They're cnidarians, stinging cells on them, nematocysts. And so most fish are going to avoid sea anemones so they don't get stung by these nematocysts. However, the clownfish is resistant to those stings. It's not affected by them. And so the clownfish can go inside of the tentacle of the sea anemone, stay in there for a while. So how does the clownfish benefit? What's it getting out of this relationship, Michael?
Safety.
Safety. Yeah, the predators aren't going to bother when it's inside those tentacles. What is a sea anemone getting? Any ideas? It's actually getting little bits of food that the clownfish brings in, scraps that fall off. That's what the sea anemone can eat. So they're both benefiting. Yeah. And then the last one is called commensalism. This is when one of the organisms benefits and the other is not affected either way. It's not helped and it's also not harmed. So it's not mutualism, it's not parasitism, it's kind of not affected. An example of this would be like a barnacle, which is a sea organism, it's a filter feeder. Sometimes they attach to whales, the side of a whale, or to the shell of a turtle. And basically hitch a ride. As the turtle or the whale swimming through the water, the barnacle filters out little bits of food, so it's benefiting. But it doesn't harm the whale at all. It doesn't harm the turtle at all. But it doesn't help them either. It just sort of doesn't affect them either way. So that's an example of commensalism. A robin building a nest in a tree would be sort of a commensalistic relationship. The robin can build a nest there, it's protected, can lay its eggs, but it doesn't hurt the tree or help the tree in any way, it just is. There's some more examples of this. Which type of relationship is this showing? Alex? Parasitism. Do you remember what these are called?
Eel.
They're not leeches.
Eel.
They look like eels, but they're not eels. They're lamprey. Remember they have that round mouth with no jaw they suck on and drill a hole in it? Those are lamprey. They're parasitic fish. Okay? This is a goby fish. It lives together with this shrimp in a little burrow in the water. And they work together. The goby stays in the burrow, digs it out, but allows the shrimp to live in there. And then the shrimp brings in little bits of food and stuff. And the shrimp actually can't see. So when it's time for it to go out to find food, the fish goes with it. And the fish is keeping an eye out for any predators. And the shrimp keeps its long antenna in contact with the fish. So if the fish starts backing back into the tunnel, then the shrimp knows to go with it. And so they have this mutualistic relationship. There's the barnacle on a sea turtle, that's commensalism. This little barnacle is not hurting the turtle. It's not helping it either. This is a polar bear. It looks pretty sick, right? Because it has parasitic tapeworm. So even though this bear probably is eating plenty of food, it's not actually getting the nutrients from that food because the tapeworms are taking most of that food. Some hermit crabs will grab sea anemones and place them on the shell and walk around with these sea anemones attached to them. It helps to protect them. Now, the sea anemone is not really benefiting, so this would be an example of commensalism. There are many mammals that have birds that live on them or spend time on them. And the birds sort of peck little insects and stuff out of their fur, helping them stay clean and not get any infections. Bird gets a meal, mammal gets sort of clean cut. Oh, there's a brain pop about it. I'm going to move ahead from these for right now. Maybe we'll come back if we have time again, but I have to finish these notes. Zach?
In South Carolina, I saw a turtle resting on an alligator.
Oh, really?
And I thought it's gonna eat it, and he stopped it.
Interesting. All right. So in an ecosystem, each species has what we call a niche. And the niche is basically sort of everything about that organism that it does, its role that it plays in that ecosystem. So when you're talking about an organism's niche, you might talk about when it eats, what it eats, where it lives in the ecosystem. What time of the day is it active? All those little factors about it are what we call its niche. So, for example, a squirrel, you might talk about its niche being living, in the forested areas, eats nuts from a variety of trees. It's active during the daytime. It buries the nuts and finds them later on. Those are all part of the squirrel's niche. Habitat is sort of the area where the organisms live. So many times organisms share the same habitat, but usually they don't have the exact same niche. For example, a deer and a squirrel have the same habitat, basically. Live in basically the same areas. But they don't have the same niche. How is their niche different? Any ideas about those animals?
The squirrel bears nuts and the deer eats things which have nuts in them and drop nuts.
Yeah, they have different foods that they're actually eating. The deer is browsing on vegetation, whereas the squirrel's eating the nuts, so they don't have the same niche. What if they did? What if the deer ate nuts from the same trees at the same time in the same habitat as the squirrel? What would happen in that situation, Brandon? Yeah, the two species would be competing with one another for the same resources. So when two organisms do have the same niche, then they compete. And usually when they're competing for resources, one organism is better suited and it wins out. What happens to the other? They die off. Or they have to find a new habitat that doesn't have that same problem. Even plants compete with each other. In fact, this is why you weed your garden. Anyone plant a garden this weekend?
Me.
And so you probably planted your garden, and you're going to have to go out and you're going to have to reduce the competition for your tomato plants or whatever you planted. How do you do that? You pluck out all the other plants, all the weeds. Because if you allow the weeds to continue to grow, they're going to be competing with your tomato plants to get nutrients from the soil and sunlight and so forth. So you reduce the competition for the tomato plants by weeding the garden. You also have to plant your plants a certain distance apart. Again, so they don't compete with each other. If you put two tomato plants right next to each other, they're going to be trying to get the same nutrients. By spreading them out, you reduce the amount of competition. All right, our last topic is this concept of succession. Now, if you imagine your yard at your house. Probably somebody goes out and mows it. Maybe it's you, maybe it's someone else. So imagine in your yard, nobody mowed it for the rest of the summer. So what would happen? What do you think it might look like by the end of the summer? Jenna? Tall grass? Uneven?
There would be a lot of trees.
Lots of weeds? Okay, let's say, again, next year, you didn't mow it ever. And 5 years in a row, you never mowed it. What do you think it might look like after 5 years, Grace?
It'd be like really tall grass. There'd be so much stuff living in there.
Would stuff other than grasses eventually begin growing?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, small like bushes and shrubs, things like that. What if you let it go for 50 years?
It wouldn't look like a lot.
It wouldn't look like a lawn. What do you think it might look like in our area? Yeah, it would look like a young forest. If you left it for 100 or 150 years, it would be a mature forest. Like you might see, if you drive up the hill near Perry Junior High, the forests around there, they're fairly mature forests. Eventually, your lawn would look like that. That process is called succession. Okay? Succession is the gradual change in an ecosystem over time after a disturbance. One set of organisms replaces another until a sort of stable ecosystem is reached. And like you guys were just saying, in our area, a stable ecosystem is a forest. If you imagine a farmer had just tilled their field and it was just soil, no plants there, and you just let it sit, never planted anything, it would eventually grow into a forest around here. If a farmer abandons a field, eventually it becomes a forest. In fact, sometimes you might be hiking, and you might be walking through the forest and see an old stone wall. Okay? And what usually that would indicate is that at one time this was a farm. The stone wall was the boundary. The stone wall's still there, but the field has been let go. It's now just part of the forest. The first organisms that can start to grow in an area, we call them the pioneer organisms. Just like in sort of U.S. history, the pioneers, like the first people started moving west. I should say the first Europeans moving west. Those are the pioneer communities. So a place like in Hawaii, right? What's happening on the island of Kauai right now? A volcano there's an active volcano, one of the most active volcanoes in the world, is releasing liquid molten rock, lava, you might call it. And it's flowing, and what happens to that rock, that lava? Eventually it cools, and what do you have? Just rock, bare rock. And that's happened many times. That's what the Hawaiian Islands are. They're all volcanic rock. When I was in Costa Rica this year, we visited the Arenal volcano. And in 1968, there's a huge eruption of Arenal. And there's all this volcanic rock that we hiked over. But it doesn't look like just bare rock anymore in Costa Rica. And most of Hawaii doesn't look like just bare rock. There's ecosystem, there's forests there. So there are organisms that can even start to exist on bare rock. What can live on bare rock? Any ideas? Moss. Lichen. Do you know what lichen is? Kind of looks like crusty, scaly stuff that grows on rocks. Those are very small organisms, but they can actually grow on bare rock that has no soil. And then as those things die and break down, they start to build up just the thinnest layer of soil until some tiny little plants can grow. And then when they die and decompose, they add to the soil. And eventually, if that happens for hundreds and thousands of years, We can go from bare rock to an actual ecosystem. Okay? Eventually, these stages get to sort of a stable ecosystem. The ecosystem changes over time until it reaches what we call the climax community, the stable environment, the sort of endpoint. It doesn't mean that plants and animals are going to live forever, but it means they're going to be replaced with similar species. In our area, you already told me, what is it? What's the climax community around here? A forest. Really, in our area, it's a beech, birch, maple forest. Native those species. Now, if you go to other parts of the world, it's not a beech, birch, maple forest. If you go just north of us, into the Adirondacks, into Canada, the climax community is not a beech, birch, maple forest. It's an evergreen forest with pines and spruces and so forth. If you go to the Midwest of the United States, climax community is not a forest, it's a grassland. If you go to Central America, the climax community in certain areas is not beech, birch, maple forest, it's a tropical rainforest or a tropical dry forest. If you go to Africa, climax community in some areas might be a desert, some areas might be a savanna. So it depends on the climate. The rainfall, the temperature, the geography of the area is what will determine the climax community. So here you just have a diagram from pioneer species. Usually after that you have small, in our area, small herbaceous plants, we call them, grasses, things like that. Then fast-growing trees, okay, aspens and poplars, birch, and eventually more slow-growing climax community. This even happens in ponds. Does anyone have a pond near your house? Or if you know of one? What you might know is that people that have a pond on their property, if they want to keep it around, they periodically have to dig the sediment out of the bottom or dredge it. Because what happens in a pond is the plants growing there, as they die and sink to the bottom, starts to fill up with sediment. If you were to let it just sit, it would completely fill up and be basically a terrestrial land ecosystem after a period of time. So it happens in ponds as well. The kind of succession we would see in Hawaii after that lava flow would be what we call primary succession. The beginning of a community on just bare rock where there was no soil. What you would have around here, if a farmer abandoned their field, would be called secondary succession, because there already was soil. And this is going to happen naturally. Forest fires, floods, mudslides, things like that can lead to disturbance, which then leads to succession. Here's a picture that's kind of interesting. This is a forest after a forest fire. You can see the charred trunks. You can see there's really nothing left, no plants left. Just 1 year later, same picture, same forest. See, succession has begun. These plants are starting to grow back again. In fact, there's some species of trees, some pines, their cones, like a pine cone, is the scales of the pine cone are stuck together, and they will not open unless they've been exposed to fire. After a fire goes through, that melts the resin that holds the cone together. They open up and drop their seeds, allowing the species to grow again after a fire has come through. Because the fire is a natural part of many ecosystems. All right, any questions about any of those topics we talked about today?